This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is polytheism. I have two experts on that subject, and I will be discussing it with them in depth in a moment. The subject today is polytheism and why this form of religion has been in many ways, I think, cast aside in favor of the monotheistic big religions, the Abrahamic religions, and other religions of the world as well. My guests are on the left, even though just audio, Edward Butler and Galina Kraskova on the right. As I usually like to do, I like to give my guests a few minutes to give a little bit of background about themselves, their belief systems, biography, and anything related to the subject at hand. So let me start with Edward. Edward, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself, how you got into polytheism, anything you've written on the subject, and so forth.
Sure. It's good to be here, first of all. My name is Edward Butler. I've been a practicing polytheist for a long time now, since the early 90s at least. And it's also been the focus of my academic work. I received my doctorate in 2004 from the New School for Social Research in New York City for my dissertation, which was titled The Metaphysics of Polytheism in Proclus, referring to a late antique Platonic philosopher. And since then, I've published numerous articles, generally in academic journals, but also in devotional volumes that have been put out within the polytheist community. I'm active within that community as I guess you could say a theorist and practitioner.
Well, let me ask, as someone who studies polytheism, and you said that you believe in it, do you believe in any specific type of polytheism, such as the old Norse gods or animism, or is polytheism sort of accepting that there are multiple ways to worship multiple aspects of nature or the cosmos?
Well, I would say that to me, polytheism is quite simply the belief in many gods. Now, when you talk about the different ways in which people can be polytheists, it's literally impossible to simply encapsulate the many different ways in which people can be polytheists. But certainly my perspective is that it is a deity-centric practice and not simply a nature religion or a pantheism, but is really focused on the worship of real individual deities.
So, just so people know, pantheism is the idea that a god or gods, some force inhabits every atom of the cosmos, whereas polytheism, you're saying, are discrete entities.
Yes, I would say that pantheism is a term that needs to be understood within a very particular intellectual context, and so I don't know how comfortable I am necessarily glossing what pantheism means, because I'm perhaps too aware of the history that it has within very particular intellectual debates in 18th and 19th century European philosophy and theology, where it was associated with Spinozists and so forth. Polytheism is really a much simpler concept. It is simply the belief in many gods, which has been actually the religion followed by most people in most places over most of history, if you really look at it.
Okay. Well, let me turn to Galina, let her introduce herself and her ideas. Galina, welcome, and if you could give a little background about yourself as well.
Thank you. My name is Selena Kraskova. Get the academic stuff out of the way first. I have a master's degree in religious studies from New York
Could you just speak up a little bit, Galina? You're not, could you, maybe about 10%?
I have a master's
There you
degree.
go, that's better.
I have a master's degree in religious studies from New York University. I've done 60 plus credits of graduate work in classics, and I'm currently pursuing a master's in medieval studies. I've published 30 books on various aspects of polytheism, from introductory books to heathenry, which is Norse flavored polytheism, to various devotionals. And Edward and I both currently edit a journal, Walking the Worlds. I blog fairly frequently at kraskova.wordpress.com. Can usually be found causing trouble.
Yeah. Well, let me ask, as I asked Edward, is your idea of polytheism, because when people who are not religious
I concur with what Edward said. Polytheism is deity-centric.
Yeah.
There's none of worshiping forces of nature. There's not pantheism. Yeah. We serve the gods. We serve individual deities.
Well, let me ask, what is the hierarchy that you believe in? I'll let Edward answer himself. I mean, is there like, when we think of Norse mythology or Greek mythology, there's like Odin, and then there's the lesser gods or whatever. Is there, or are all the deities that you worship on a like in Congress, all congressmen are equal, so all gods are equal?
I would never refer to a deity as lesser. I actually practice two forms of polytheism. I practice heathenry, and I also practice cultus deorum, which is Roman polytheism. So I'm dealing with various families of gods. And that's very much how I see them. Polytheism is ultimately relational. So we're looking at tribes of gods, families of gods. The hierarchy that exists, in my mind, is our role in relationship to the gods.
So I know with one of the things that's most interesting and entertaining about a Roman or Greek gods is how they were always sort of bickering. It was almost like, the old idea of soap operas, and that the gods were constantly scheming against one another. Are the gods in your pantheon, if you will, they're not the so-called perfect God that the Christians or Abrahamic religions believe in? Your gods are fallible, they make mistakes, they scheme. Is that fair?
Well, unlike the Judeo-Christian God, our gods rarely engage in genocide. So the stories point to parts of their nature. They point to mysteries about the gods, ways of engaging with them, areas of expertise that the gods may hold. And yeah, our gods are not perfect. I think perfectionism is a horrific thing to project onto the gods, onto anything, anyone. I mean, to say that something is perfect is to say that it's unchanging. To say that something is unchanging is to separate that being from the capacity to experience and appreciate our humanity, and vice versa. So no, we don't have perfection of good immortal gods, but we don't reify perfection.
Go ahead, Edward. You wanted to say something?
A few things. I mean, first of all, I think that it's a common mistake to place too much weight on the poets, which is where you get that sort of picture that you gave of these squabbling gods and so forth. During the time when these faiths were living faiths, and of course we must never forget that there are still living, continuous polytheistic faiths in the world. Absolutely. Quite a few of them. But even with respect to the cults from antiquity, the center of gravity of these religions was the daily life of temples and devotion by people. The works of the poets, they're really, for the vast majority of people, they were really tangential. And their portrait of the gods was even controversial in their day. There was a lot of criticism in ancient Greece, for example, of certain kind of tone that poets like Homer took about the gods. And then also we have traditions that didn't have that sort of poetic narrative about the gods going on at all. And so it's a mistake to place too much value on that aspect as though that really gives us the picture, because it's distorted for us. I mean, we have Homer to read. We don't have, the living temples to see, and the festivals to see, and the daily religious life of the people in ancient Greece or Rome or wherever to see.
Absolutely, and it's important to understand that there were ancient philosophers that considered Homer and other poets somewhat impious because of the way that they presented the gods in their works. I mean, this is one piece of it, as Edward said. If we look just at the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Homeric hymns, Hesiod, etc., we're not getting a full picture of the religion at all.
So do you think that, the Homers and the Virgils sort of skewed things and selectively edited things the way, say, the Council of Nicaea did for the Christians?
You can't compare them to the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea had an authoritative purpose that these poets did not. These poets were taking poetic license.
Okay.
And in some cases, particularly with Virgil, there was a strong political perspective to their work. Virgil was writing after a vicious civil war in Rome, after Octavian had become Augustus, had taken power, after the fall of the Republic, and much of his writing was consciously creating a Roman epic, one that would culminate in linking the might of Augustus all the way back to Aeneas and the Trojan War that would lend legitimacy to Augustus's reign. There was a political dimension to their writing, and Hesiod and Homer, they were poets. They were taking poetic license, but we're not talking about one authority that will determine orthodoxy for a conglomerate church in quite the same way that you saw, or in anything approximating what you saw with the councils.
Okay, Edward, let me ask you. Galena has mentioned the Roman gods. Do you practice the same polytheistic beliefs that she does, or do you have a separate ideology of gods or hierarchy?
I worship an assortment of deities from a few different pantheons. There is some overlap between me and Galena in that we worship some of the same deities, and we certainly are in religious fellowship together. I mean, with respect to this sort of question of hierarchy and of the status of different gods relative to one another, I wanted to point out that there can be different ways of approaching this question, and in particular, some of the philosophers that I work with, philosophers like Proclus or Damascius, for instance, Platonic philosophers, they actually would speak of the gods as being perfect. And they would regard the things that are said about them in the myths and by the poets that one might think to indicate imperfection, they would interpret those things symbolically. And so, while there are certainly polytheists who will adopt the position that the gods aren't perfect, I wanted to stress that for the philosophers I work with, they would say that the gods are perfect,
Uh-huh.
and they would interpret symbolically many of the things that we read about them in the myths. They would say that these are communications of mysteries.
And I would say that in comparison with our human understanding, yeah, they are. I don't think it's on us to judge the gods. That's when people start talking about perfection and imperfection, it leads to what gods are worthy of veneration, and that to me is something very much approximating hubris. So for me, the question is jarring. It's like it does not matter whether they are perfect or imperfect. That is a judgment that we are not positioned to make. That's my perspective on it.
Edward, did you have a comment?
No, I would agree with what she said. I think that even if one thought that they were in some sense imperfect, it would not be something that, from a human perspective, we could usefully. We can't evaluate them in that way. And so whether one said in an absolute sense that they're perfect or in an absolute sense imperfect, we can't evaluate them in that way.
Well, let me ask about, because when most non-polytheists think of polytheism, they think that there's a gods for this or that. There's a gods for certain emotions. There's a god that creates earthquakes. There's a god that's in charge of ice or monsoons or something. Are there?
That's misleading.
Yeah, I was going to ask: are the gods in your hierarchy or your pantheon? Are they in charge of specific aspects of the cosmos?
No, I would say that this is a typically modern misunderstanding of polytheism. For someone who is the particular devotee of a certain deity, that deity is at least potentially all things to them. For someone who is only peripherally concerned with a particular deity, that deity may be concerned with some narrow function that they only need recourse to in a particular circumstance of their life, for instance. And so it's one of the artifacts of our modern perspective on these faiths, one of the misleading artifacts of that perspective, is that we tend to look at all of the deities from this peripheral perspective and see them as having these narrowly circumscribed functions. And that's, again, partly because of an excessive reliance on the poets. It's also because of other intellectual and conceptual confusions and distortions that have arisen over time. But I would say that each deity is potentially all things to their peculiar devotee. And this is definitely what one sees if one actually studies the religious life of antiquity, and indeed the religious life of contemporary polytheists such as Hindus.
Well, let me just ask you then, Edward, since you mentioned that you worship several, if all of these gods or goddesses, I would assume, are capable of being all things at once, what is the necessity to have 2 or 17 or 54 if one can suffice?
Please let me jump in.
Go ahead.
Having many friends when you can have just one.
They exist, and it is our place to venerate them. They exist, and they're magnificent, and one can have an engaged devotional practice with them, and it is right and proper and pious to do so. So why would you begin to truncate your devotional and spiritual life into ever smaller blocks. I mean, you don't have just one friend. You don't have just one family member. You don't go throughout your life only, I would hope, only talking to one person. I mean, this one person exists. Yay, I don't ever have to talk to anyone else again. It doesn't work that way. And the gods, they tend to have family relationships. There are connections between these powers. And once you engage with one, you will often be brought into devotional practice with another and another.
Well,
Exactly.
but the thing though is, if you have 20 friends or something, one friend may know more about poetry, another knows more about philosophy, another one is good at playing checkers or whatever your favorite pastime is. So you spend certain times with certain friends for certain reasons. Is that the same thing that you would do with a god or goddess?
Mutatis.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
pretty
Yes.
much. I have certain devotional times that I'll spend with Odin, certain devotional times that I'll spend with Hermes, or Apollo, or Dionysus, or Frigga, or Freya, or Mani, or Loki. I mean, it depends. It depends where I am personally feeling pulled in my devotions. And then there are certain days that I will give special attention to certain deities. And there are numerous deities that I respect, but they are not part of my devotional life. This is part of the polyvalence, I think, of polytheism, the flexibility and the fluidity. I mean, if a polytheist in the ancient world that honor their household gods, the gods of their state, the gods of their ancestors, the gods of their family, that honor their state gods, of course, and then they were free to initiate into any cultist that they wished. So you get some very interesting combinations, and this is part and parcel of having a functional devotional life, is you work that out. And then, of course, there's venerating one's ancestors and whatever other spirits happen to be part of one's devotional life. But you work it out. You develop the pattern of practice based on your experience with the gods. And that's just something that you learn as you go.
Let me ask.
I would say,
go ahead.
let me just say quickly, I think that when we are comparing it to, human relationships, I think that we're at least having closer to the right sort of conversation about these things than when we're talking about them as abstract, tightly circumscribed functions and the like. We're at least closer to having the right kind of conversation, even though obviously, there are differences between the relationship with other humans and the relationship with gods. We're at least, more in the ballpark, I would say, of like having the right kind of conversation.
Well,
I would agree with that.
let me. I want to talk a little bit about the history of polytheism, monotheism, but I want to start with there's an old saying that atheists like to use about certainly monotheism, monotheistic religions, that everyone is an atheist minus their own God, minus one. Would a polytheist like you people, do you include, say, for example, Allah or Yahweh or the Christian, the Abrahamic gods within your own polytheistic beliefs as well as equal?
I'll take that one, Edward. I believe that they exist.
Yeah.
I do not venerate them.
Okay.
I do have a devotional relationship with Mary because several of my ancestors were very deeply devoted to her.
Uh-huh.
And as part of my ancestor work, I've come into a devotional practice with her. But for the most part, it's an incredibly small part of my practice. And no, I don't venerate Christ or Allah or certainly not Yahweh.
How about you, Edward?
I'd say basically the same, minus the particular devotion that Galina has to Mary. I don't dispute the existence of these gods, but I don't have a relationship with them personally, and I have good friends who are worshippers of these deities, but I don't have a relationship with them in principle, I certainly recognize their existence, but I have no relationship with them.
Well, Galina anticipated my next question, basically, which is that is monotheism, as people think of it, really not monotheistic but polytheistic? Because when you think of the triune God, isn't that really just not just three aspects of one, but three? And you said Mary, for example. Mary is seen as a goddess, a de facto goddess, really, in Christian religion, the virgin birth and whatnot. So is Christianity really monotheistic?
You are projecting terms onto that a Catholic, a Christian, and certainly a Catholic would object to. They very much do not see Mary as a goddess.
Yeah.
As it may look like that at the outside. And an awful lot of the differences between Protestantisms and Catholicism centered around the role of Mary and the role of the saints. They do not worship them as deities.
Yeah.
I would say that Islam is the purest form of monotheism.
Yeah.
But while I think that Catholicism would make a hell of a lot more sense if it just embraced polytheism and got on with things, they do not consider themselves polytheistic. And if you read Aquinas, if you read Augustine, if you read Origen, they're bending over backwards to accommodate a doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah.
That is not polytheistic. Meanwhile, polytheists are looking at that and being like, "We see what you did there."
Yeah. Well, that's my claim. There are people who say we're not related to other simian forms and whatnot, when clearly the DNA of Christianity seems to have derived from polytheistic predecessors.
And certainly in Catholicism, you see more of that. I think that's been a bone of contention that eventually was one of the factors that led to the Protestant Reformation. But I believe polytheism is the natural, spiritual, organic default for the human psyche. And monotheism is not evolution. I think that the problem is keeping people from becoming polytheistic, from returning to polytheism, because it's that natural default. So, there are polytheistic antecedents to monotheism, but monotheism's been fighting against since its 2,000 years of existence.
Edward, do you agree with Galina in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason to dispute the self-understanding of Christians or Muslims with respect to their religions. Now, if you want to talk about historical antecedents, I mean, for me, that kind of discussion has to be kept in a different intellectual register, so to speak, from a discussion about what these religions, how they understand themselves, and they're entitled to their self-understanding and their self-definition, and I would respect that just as I would hope that they would respect that of my own tradition. And so...
Well, let me talk a little bit about science and religion, because one of the things that you get in modern culture, you'll get a lot of fundamentalist Christians, and certainly fundamentalist Muslims, and even fundamentalist Jews that will, deny, for example, scientific interpretations of things such as evolution, such as the creation of the universe, now thought to be caused by a big bang 14 or so billion years ago. Do either of your belief systems reject modern science the way that a lot of the monotheists do, or is there a concordance between science and your beliefs? Let me start with Galina. I'm sorry, could you speak up?
I think polytheism pretty much invented science. I mean, our ancestors weren't stupid. They were keenly observant of the natural world. But there's no conflict for me with accepting modern scientific discoveries and my religious beliefs. Where conflicts may arise is in the realm of ethics, but that's a different question altogether. No, I don't see a conflict, and I don't think many polytheists do.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly we don't buy in necessarily wholesale to the messages of modernity, but scientific advancement, that's that's a non-issue for most of us.
So, like some Christian sects that wouldn't allow blood transfusions or something, that's something that's not in your ballpark.
That's an issue.
Yeah. How about you, Edward?
Yeah, I would just agree. I mean, I don't feel any conflict with modern science. I would agree very much with Galina's remark that polytheists invented science, and the sciences flourished and historically have flourished in polytheist civilizations such as ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, India, China. I see no conflict whatsoever.
Well, let me go back to the scientific idea of the creation of the universe, and certainly there are creation myths throughout religions and all types of mythologies in human society. Do you, if you do subscribe to the scientific idea, perhaps of a Big Bang, and I don't want to get off into the scientific debates about that, but would then the gods have naturally arisen out of that act of creation, or were they there before and precipitated it? Either one of you.
I can maybe field that first. I would say that precisely the reason why, at least for me, and I mean, you have to say, many polytheists would have different ways of understanding this, this relationship. But for me, part of the reason why there's no conflict between science and my religion is because because whatever the story is about the physical universe is not a story about the gods, because the gods to me are immaterial, they're metaphysical, and therefore whatever is the case about the physical constitution of the cosmos and its history in time simply doesn't affect them. It's not relevant. It's kind of like asking about the relevance of something in biology, say, to algebra.
So you do. So in other words,
they're simply operating in different registers entirely. They're simply not relevant to one another.
So basically, your polytheistic view is generally in accordance with monotheism, in that your gods are dualistic, that they are outside of the natural order, the materialistic universe. Then, correct?
No, I would say that they are inside and outside.
Okay.
I would agree.
They operate within the physical cosmos, but they are not constrained to it. They are not only present in it. But it's not dualistic in the sense that they are only present outside it.
Well, let me just ask this then, because I've done a series of shows on modern ideas of the multiverse, and it seems that what you're saying then, it would seem to me that what you just stated about inside and out, you would then be open to the idea of multiple cosmoses, not only multiple gods, but that there are multiple realities, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so within the Norse
cosmology. Okay. So you then, I guess, Galina, would assent to everything that Edward did?
If I could just add, in certain respects, we could say that that's exactly what we have going on in the different cosmoi, if I might pluralize the Greek term cosmos, the different cosmoi of different pantheons, in a certain respect, could be seen as a similar concept to that of the multiverse.
Which means that those of us who move amongst the different cosmoi, I like that, the different cosmoi, are then moving between these different worlds, these different modes of being, these different methods of perception.
Now, then if they are both inside and out, you still get to sort of the thing that's one of the major tensions between atheists and theists in general, and that is the sort of infinite regression that if God or gods are eternal and outside, someone must have created them. So then the cosmos must be eternal because you can just eliminate a god or gods as well. Do the gods that you worship or believe in, are they then ever eternal? They have always been in one form or another. They will always be. They are in all things. I mean, you're not pantheists, you said, but when I say in all things, in that they've always been, I guess, that they are eternal.
You want to take that one, Edward?
Certainly, I mean, I know it gets tiresome, but I always have to preface, different polytheists will have a different take on these matters.
Yeah.
But as a Platonist and a polytheist, I believe that the gods are eternal, which means that they are beyond time. Eternity isn't a matter of piling time upon time. It's a question, the way that I look at it, of an ontological priority relative to time.
Mm-hmm.
And so this question of, well, at what point in the history of the physical universe did the gods come to be, is a senseless question to me. At a certain point in the history of the universe, certain creatures on a certain planet became capable of interacting with these deities and had a certain historical interaction with them and so forth. But that's a question of change on our end. On our side.
Galina, do you have a comment?
I would absolutely concur with that, and I think that eternal, these temporal ideas, the gods are above temporality and materiality. They are not yoked to it in the way that we are yoked to it, and therefore even the language by which we're discussing this, the gods are beyond that. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're not bound by temporal concerns.
Okay. Well, let me, since Edward, you've spoken several times, you've mentioned the idea of Platonism, and for people who don't know, this is basically the idea that there are eternal truths, most of these sort of abstract ideas fixae, if you will. Excuse me. So, do the gods in your theology, are they actors in the material world? We talked about the poets, just as in the biblical myths, the poets of Homer and whatnot, the gods will tempt or they'll try to seduce or whatnot. Do the gods in your polytheistic view, do they act in the material world for specific reasons, such as the enlightenment of an individual or a group of individuals?
They have their agendas, and yes, they do act in the material world, but I don't necessarily think that any one person is at the center of their agenda. I think it's natural for us to want to filter and speculate on the motivations of the gods through the lens of our humanity, but I think we're really a very small part in their eternal plans. But yeah, I because they can engage with us, then it follows that they are capable of acting on the material plane.
Yeah, so when someone wants to do something, I mean, the idea of the quest is an old concept, and certainly the gods with Jason and the Argonauts being probably the most famous one from the Greek myths. The hero sets out to do this, that, or the other thing to please the god or to gain knowledge or to fulfill some prophecy. If we're talking in the modern world, these ideas of I have to do A, B, or C in my life are not things set forth by the gods confronting an individual, but people have agency, in other words, and you have an agency to do what you will, right?
But then there's the choice. Are you going to do what is correct, i.e. what is in alignment with what the gods would have you do? Or are you going to go off and do what you want to do, heedless of what your fate and what the gods might be required? And this is why many polytheisms are religions of diviners. They have oracles and diviners. You go, you find out what the gods want, and hopefully you do it. These heroes were pursuing quests. Like you look at Achilles, he wanted glory. He wanted immortality. He was vying with a fate that said, you have a choice. You can live to be a fine old man surrounded by family and children, and you will die in obscurity. Or you can go and fight at Troy, and you will die young, but you will have immortal glory. And the gods were with him, and his mother was a goddess. Achilles is in this. This is one of one of the more famous, as with Jason and the Argonauts, one of the more famous heroes. The gods were with him every step of the way, and he had a choice. That final choice was his, but he needed to make it. Mm. Once he made it, and even before he made it, the gods were certainly acting. Now, I'm talking about Homer's story, of course, because it was such a potent narrative for both Greece and Rome. But I think that if we have devotional relationships with the gods, that presupposes that they can engage with us, which they do. And there are ways to find out if what you're doing is in alignment with what is best for you in service to them. This with the idea being that it is our purpose as human beings to find and maintain right relationship with the holy powers and to allow everything in our world to unfold from that. If you're asking, are there commandments like the Ten Commandments? No. We draw our ethical code somewhat from our relationship with our gods, but you're kind of expected to obey the laws of your country. Mm. I mean, ancient polytheists, and I think our modern polytheists are very similar, did not need an ethical code written down to know how to behave. That was the job of the polis. That was the job of your community, to teach you proper ethics. The job of religion is to teach you how to engage rightly with the gods.
How about you, Edward? Do you believe that gods act in the material cosmos?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that what Galina said just now was excellent. There's no need within a polytheistic framework to foreclose notions of individual agency or to foreclose a relative autonomy of moral and ethical inquiry either. I mean, this is why, philosophy and ethics also have flourished in polytheistic civilizations. Again, ancient Greece, India, China have tremendous not only theological traditions, but philosophical traditions and ethical traditions of ethical inquiry that do not, they neither ignore the existence of a theological dimension, nor do they reduce themselves to it. And so the relative autonomy of these different spheres of inquiry, of moral inquiry, of scientific inquiry, of philosophical inquiry, is something that polytheism is inherently comfortable with. And it's one of the things that makes it, I think, much more satisfying intellectually than many varieties of monotheism, for whom even a relative autonomy of these spheres of inquiry is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me go on. When we go into the next segment, I want to talk more about ethics and some basic philosophical questions, since I've been trying to sort of limb out the idea or the hierarchy, the terms and whatnot of polytheism. But let me end this segment by asking this. I am an agnostic and an atheist, and I know that a lot of the Abrahamic religion that I'm damned to hell. Do the gods in both of your viewpoints, if I don't believe in them, do they just sort of shrug a shoulder and say, well, whatever,
We don't really believe in proselytizing.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to hell because you don't venerate the same gods I do. I think that attitude is completely alien to the polytheistic worldview. Venerate which gods you want or none, but just don't interfere with other people's veneration.
Yeah. How about you, Edward?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree.
Okay, well, let's end this segment. In my next segment, like I said, I want to talk a little bit more about ethos and belief systems and whatnot. We'll do that in a moment. Speaking of polytheism with Galina Kraskova and Edward Butler, the first half of the show, I was trying to sort of limb out for people who don't know what polytheism is, how it works, different historical background of it. Now I want to talk a little bit sort of the interior belief systems, how they affect people on a daily basis, ethics, that sort of thing. When I was raised as a Lutheran, and I went to church until I was 9 years old, until I remember passing by my pastor's office and hear him talking about using the collection money to buy a sports car. And after that, I sort of like, well, this is just bullshit and whatnot. And I never went back to church again. And I think that a lot of people have similar types of moments, maybe not as overt as that. But one of the things I remember thinking of as to why the Greek gods, if I was going to be religious, made sense was that the idea of monotheism is terrible at dealing with a lot of things, but most of all, let's say, the concept of evil, because you get to that conundrum of there's just one single God and this God is all good. Well, then he can't be all powerful, and if he's all powerful, he can't be all good, because you wouldn't have genocides, rape, murder, bigotry, child abuse, etc., etc. Whereas if you have a polytheistic viewpoint, well, you can talk about bad things happening because there's some conflict with the gods. But from what you said, it would seem to me that you don't believe that either. How does the polytheistic viewpoint deal with the idea of evil in the modern world, or the ancient world for that matter? Edward? Go, either one.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can, I can give my thoughts. I mean, what I would see as being particularly important in this regard is the kind of relative autonomy that the gods have granted to processes in the physical world, such that, for instance, we can understand them scientifically, and we can also, in moral and ethical questions, exercise our own powers of intellectual and moral inquiry. The kind of relative autonomy of these spheres, I think, accounts in part as a corollary for some of these phenomena that, if we were to imagine a universe where these sorts of bad things weren't even possible, we would also have to imagine a universe where there was no kind of autonomy whatsoever to physical and material processes, because so much of the evil in the world actually we can see as having to do with material factors, psychological factors, and the fact that these realms are able to run, in a certain respect on their own, and to operate according to their own laws and on their own terms that we have insight into. And that is a sort of a good in itself, even though it's also the cause in another regard of things that we would certainly regard as being evils.
I think it puts a lot of responsibility on us to develop ourselves as decent human beings. And I think that we often fail in that responsibility.
Well, Galina, earlier you had sort of mocked the notion of perfection in the monotheistic depiction of the singular God. But if perfection is not something that even the gods can attain, then certainly some of them must stumble too. So there must be gods that commit evil acts too. Is that not correct?
Again, I can't answer that question because that would be me making a value judgment on powers that are beyond my comprehension. I really, really hesitate to say, yes, that God is good, that is not our place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I think that the gods are the good, immortal gods, period. I think that it's troublesome waters in terms of respect and reverence and piety when we start projecting our notions of how we think the cosmos should work onto them and bringing them down to our level.
So then evil is just a human thing.
I think evil is a human thing. I do believe that there are entropic forces that may rank themselves against the gods and attempt to destroy that which the gods have wrought, but it always takes a human being to let it in.
How about you, Edward?
Philosophically, I don't accept that the gods are capable of evil. No, I think that my perspective is that the gods are the ultimate ground of goodness in the universe, and they are, each of them, an absolute good of a unique kind. And so I would say that I would definitely say that evils belong to the mortal realm.
Now, I would concur with that.
Now,
I very much agree with that.
When you say that, though, do you then look at, like Galina had talked about, entropic forces? Now, some scientists sort of dismiss the idea of evil as just, someone may have a brain that just doesn't function normally, so that person becomes a serial killer, or they become a despot, or they become, in a time of war, they may wipe out a whole hamlet or something. So do you then look at evil then as in the polytheistic view as sort of a disembodied force that sort of permeates the cosmos, like, say, the old idea of ether?
We don't have a devil or anything like that.
Well, no, I'm saying a disembodied force, some force like the equivalent of gravity, or the four cosmic scientific forces, something that they are, or is that just the human will gone awry?
I think I don't think that we need to project evil onto any disembodied force. I think that human beings are more than capable of bringing in all the evil that we might need. I think that evil is a matter of being out of alignment with the gods. I think it's a matter of having our perceptions so incredibly clouded that we can't see what is good and harmonious and proper, even when it's standing right in front of us. I think it's a matter of poor character and poor choices, and self-serving choices.
Edward,
and also, like you said, physical and psychological malfunction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, let me turn to a few other things. Is there a place, for example, in either of your viewpoints for the idea of miracles, i.e. things that cannot be explained by current scientific forces?
Absolutely, because the gods are capable of acting in the world. I absolutely believe in the miraculous.
But do we see any evidence of it?
I had someone come out of nowhere because she read something that I had wrote. And this woman became my adopted mother, and she furthered me in my devotion more than anything else, and taught me more and sustained me through a horrible time in my life. And we came together specifically because of the gods. I consider that a miracle. So what do you define as miraculous? I consider the fact that I can sit down in devotion to my gods and feel them and taste them and smell them and have a complete sensory experience of them to be miraculous. That as a diviner, I can go out and open myself up to the omens in the world and see the work the gods have wrought and interpret it for those that come to me. I consider that miraculous. That I can see and sense the gods, that they exist, that we have the capacity through the devotional relationship to engage with them. I find that miraculous. Do I think that the gods can come in and with a snap of their metaphorical fingers change reality for people? Yes, I do, under certain circumstances. I think that because, as Edward said, that the natural processes are relatively self-sustaining, I think that care has to be taken there. I think the care has to be taken in assuming that the gods are going to come in and solve all of our problems. I do not think that is their function. But do I believe in the miraculous? Absolutely.
Well, the thing, though, when you talk about your experience, I mean, there are people who believe that, for example, the act of procreation is miraculous, when that's certainly something that has been done hundreds of billions of times in human history. Estimates range from 60 to 120 billion human beings that have ever lived. So, I mean, that may be interesting scientifically, and it may, the idea that you from a billion years ago could have existed might seem like a miracle, but those are all natural forces. When we speak of miracles, we're talking about if you were walking along somewhere and say a woolly mammoth just appeared out of nowhere, that would be considered miraculous.
And I'd sacrifice.
Well, I think that in some
gods, because that'd be awesome. I'd be like, Thor's gonna have to see this.
Edward, go ahead.
I think that in some respects, this is really coming from a perspective that's distinctively Christian, particularly, and probably even of rather recent vintage. This sort of notion of the miraculous as something which the whole function of which is to put a limit to a rational explanation of the cosmos and sort of forcibly put in a wedge that makes space for religion and for the divine. This, I think, is a kind of this is a kind of dilemma that's peculiar to the antagonism in modernity between particularly Christianity and science in the West. I agree with Galina that the miraculous is all around us. The sense in which something has a value of revealing divine action is not incompatible with, say, a physical explanation for that phenomenon in physical terms, because these understandings apply to different registers. And so it's not a question of one of these occupying the space and therefore the other one can't. Because a physical explanation, say, of, you said, the act of conception, a whole range of factors have no relevance for the purely physical explanation of the act of conception. Ethical factors have no relevance. Questions of, a person's agency or consent, for instance, have no relevance to a purely physical explanation, yet they're indispensable in terms of how we actually view such an event. And so similarly, when we talk about a theological perspective on physical events and processes, that doesn't obstruct, at least from my point of view, and from, I think, the typically polytheistic point of view, that doesn't obstruct the evaluation of these events or processes from a perspective of the physical sciences, for instance.
Well, let me ask about the idea of soul, polytheist, monotheist, and even I think some scientists, from a scientific perspective, will believe in the dualistic notion that there's more to the material world, that perhaps there is existence or consciousness after death. People have claimed to have had near-death experiences where they'll meet Jesus or Buddha, or I guess if one of you had that, you might meet whatever gods that you worship. Do you believe in ensoulment, the eternality of such? And do you believe in ideas of reincarnation in some form or another? Let me start with Galina.
Yes, I do. Certainly in the Norse cosmology, the soul has multiple parts, of which the physical body in any given incarnation is part of the soul, sloughed off at death. But we absolutely do believe in reincarnation, most of us. I mean, your mileage may vary. You're always going to have polytheists that take a different stance. But for the most part, yes, we believe in reincarnation, and we believe in that there is that part of the soul always reaching out for our gods, perhaps always in communion with.
Now, let me just ask 1 second, Edward. Let me just ask, so is the soul then, if that's eternal, the soul in this lifetime is known as Galina Kraskova. It doesn't get recycled and become something different. That soul may be called Billy Joe Wilson in the next one, or it might have been, Lancelot Delacq in a previous one.
Yeah, I personally don't believe in reincarnation into animal form or elemental form. I think many heathens believe that you reincarnate down your family line. I don't necessarily think that's the case either personally, but I do believe in reincarnation into different human form. I think you get options. I don't think it's any necessarily one specific thing. And of course, we're not going to know until we're dead. But I think you get some options. I don't think that it's always X, Y, and Z in every single case.
And as in the Buddhist ideal, is the purpose of reincarnation that in each incarnation the soul somehow improves, or is your idea of reincarnation that it's just a physical process, the way breathing or the heart beating is?
I think that there is work to be done. I think that we come in with a certain scaffolding in which we're expected to work, things to do. I think that it's improvement to some extent. And the gathering of experience. I mean, as we experience the world, I like to think that maybe our gods experience it through us as well. I mean, one of the things that I find miraculous, to go back to another topic, is that we are windows for our gods in this world.
How about you, Edward? What are the ideas of the soul and reincarnation and the eternality? What is your belief system? Is it similar to Galina's?
Well, I mean, first of all, it has to be said that this varies tremendously among different polytheist traditions, and so I mean, here, one could get into the specifics of this or that tradition. Having a somewhat more general perspective also available to me as a philosopher, I certainly do believe that the soul, by its nature, is a living entity, and that it lives on. And certainly within Platonism, historically, there was a belief in reincarnation there was a belief in the soul's ability within certain constraints and within the constraints of its own powers and degree of insight to make choices about its future life, but also limitations and constraints on that choice. And historically, Platonists also definitely believed in the passage of souls into different kinds of bodies, both different human bodies and also between humans and other kinds of animals. This was a feature of the Platonic tradition, certainly. And so, I would stress, though, the wide diversity of doctrines on these matters in different polytheist traditions. And, when I speak with my philosopher's hat on, so to speak, I'm not speaking about what's true over and above all of those traditions. I'm speaking in a sense of, what can be said kind of radically more emptily and formally than those traditions.
And it's also important to point out that because we are free to initiate into as many cultists as we are called to do, that will change things. I mean, as a heathen, I may have certain beliefs about what's going to happen to my soul, but if, say, I then initiate into the mysteries of Dionysus, they may change. I mean, there's not, as Edward said, it's really important to emphasize that there's not one single overarching belief across all polytheisms.
Well, you just said as a heathen. So where does you talk about the Norse beliefs or the Greek or Roman beliefs, and you can talk about Hinduism, I guess. Do you sort of wear multiple hats at different times in your life then, Galina?
Well, as I said, I practice multiple traditions. I practice heathenry, which is Norse polytheism, and cultus deorum, which is Roman polytheism. It doesn't really matter to me. I mean, I venerate the gods in the manner that they wish. You can call me whatever you want. At the end of the day, I'm a polytheist, and that's probably the more important identity. Heathenry or cultus deorum, that's the flavor of polytheism I'm practicing. Mm-hmm. And I can move from one to the other fairly fluently. I guess it's like moving from one dialect to another.
Okay. Well, let me return to something that was brought up earlier, and I want to touch on it a little bit more deeply. And that is the idea of free will and agency. And in either of your belief systems, Galina or Edward, do you believe that the gods can know the future, or that the future is knowable, or not? Because you would run into the same philosophical problem whether there's one or many gods. If that the future is known, then it's hard to believe that there can be free will or agency for humans, or even for the gods for that matter. So what are your belief systems on free will and agency in a polytheistic tradition, Galina?
Let's take this one because I am a diviner. I think that there's potentiality. I think that gods absolutely can see all the possible threads that could come into play. Which threads will come into play depend a lot on our choices and what we do with the information we're given. When I sit down to divine for a person, I am going to the gods to request, or to the ancestors, to request information about that person's fate and about whatever mess they're coming to me to have untangled. I can give them the information that I'm given. Whether or not things work out in the most optimal way, the potentiality of which the gods will see, will depend on what that person does with the information. You can lead a horse to water, as the saying goes, but you can't make them drink. I mean, I think that the future isn't set so much as there is potentiality.
Yeah.
People being creatures of habit, which we are, that some threads of potential are stronger and brighter than others.
Yeah.
And more likely to come into being.
But nonetheless, that would make you not a determinist.
I think we come in with a scaffolding.
Yeah.
We come in with certain things we're meant to learn, certain things we're meant to do. There may be ancestral debt that we have to deal with.
What does that mean, ancestral debt? That if your grandfather murdered, a tribe of Indians, that you have to pay for it?
That's very simplistic. Is that things that happen in your family don't just go away. There is no way. Let's do away with this idea that things just go away and just magically disappear. That if my grandfather or great grandfather participated in some atrocity, well, the repercussions of that can affect the integrity of my ancestral line. It's luck. It's ultimately that debt's going to come down and is going to need to be dealt with. I mean, what do you think is happening in the U.S. today? These things don't just go away. Look at ancient Greek tragedy. All of them are family drama. Somewhere in 4 or 5 generations back, somebody in the family line did something grossly impious, hubristic, stupid, and probably vicious. And that set into motion a chain of events. That changed which potentiality was more likely to come into being. It altered the future of that family line. And every descendant then has to deal with that.
Well, that seems inherently unfair. Let's say if you had a
life was fair, where do you think that where do you think that anything is fair? It's how is it inherently unfair? If your ultimate ancestor had behaved properly to begin with, well, then you'd have one less mess to clean up. Nobody ever said any of this was fair. The universe is not fair. The universe, shit happens. And you have to clean it up. If I go out tomorrow and get into a bar fight and beat the crap out of someone, there are going to be consequences to that. And those consequences aren't going to stop when I pay my bail. That's going to have an effect on my finances. It's going to have an effect on what job I can get. That will have an effect, if I had children, that would have an effect on my children and their future prospects. It's cause and effect. You want to talk about fate? You want to talk about free will? We make choices, and there's cause and effect. We don't get to avoid the effect. There's causality and consequence.
Yeah,
nobody ever said any of it was fair.
Yeah, but when you're talking about someone that might have existed 150 years ago in your family tree that didn't know about something, and if they committed...
You are not separate. You are not separate. This is what we believe. You are part... It's not just you. Uh-huh. When I walk into a room and when I see someone, I'm engaging individual to individual, but there's also, I bring with me my entire family line. I bring with me my gods. I bring with me my spirits. This is one of the major differences, I think, that we have with, this is one of the major points of tension with modernity. We do not reify the individual to the degree that modernity does. I am much more interested, yes, in the individual to a degree, but they are not separate from their ancestral line and everything that entails. And it's complex, and it's interesting, and it's wonderful, but they do not act alone. They're not separate from their gods. They're not separate from any of this.
How about you, Edward? Ideas about free will and also the sins of the father. Do you agree with Galene in that respect?
Well, I think that she's absolutely correct to talk in terms of potentialities, causalities, all of them multiple. And philosophically, I certainly reject determinism for the simple reason that it's the wholesale reduction of one plane of experience to another. And that's just always going to be an intellectual mistake from my point of view. With respect to things like, these kinds of questions of, ancestral guilt, for instance. I mean, some of the ancient philosophers wrote in a very helpful fashion on these things. Proclus wrote a whole essay on fate, and another on evils and so forth. And I think that one of the things we should look at is we participate in many kinds of unities that are either larger than others or that overlap each other at different points. And so, for example, insofar as I'm the citizen of a particular city or nation, and that city or nation has a certain history and has incurred certain kinds of consequences through its actions, I participate in that. As a member of a certain family, I participate in the history and the experiences of that family. I mean, even just in the very straightforward sense that I'm shaped by having been brought up by them, and so my psyche is affected by them, and shaped by their experiences, their history, their baggage. And so too, on a physical level, as a physical organism, I'm subject to all the kinds of infirmities that are associated with a particular family line, but also with being an animal of a particular species. And so, because we're participating in so many different kinds of unities and collectives on so many different levels, we're constantly experiencing causalities that transcend our involvement in certain other spheres. And so, you're constantly dealing with the kind of overlap and interference of one sphere with another.
I like that description, Edward, the overlap and interference. I think that's a very apt way to put it.
Let me ask about, we talked about ethos and morals. I've always drawn a distinction between the two. To me, ethos is something that arose naturally, a sense of right and wrong. I'm not going to go up, for example, to a woman with a pram and take her baby and throw it out into a busy highway. That would be undeniably a wicked or evil thing. But there are things such as the modern idea of situational ethics. Do your frameworks of belief systems account for situational ethics, and that other people from other cultures, or whether they're religious or philosophical or political or whatnot, can have equally valid ideas in certain things that aren't as black and white as, say, tossing a baby out into a busy highway? Either one of you.
You take it, Edward.
Well, again, I would have to, it's implicit in the question, of course, the kind of diversity of perspectives. But I mean, if you're asking for certain kinds of moral universals, my impulse is to sort of put on my philosopher's hat. I mean, I'm not clergy as Galina is, and so, I don't, when I speak about things, for the most part, I don't bother speaking very much about, my personal practice, because it's not that interesting or important. Where I feel that I can speak more expansively is as a philosopher, and from a philosophical perspective, which is also polytheistic and informed by that theology. With respect to moral universals, what I try to look at, because of course people are coming from many different worldviews, and they're going to see things very differently. I think that the best hope for discerning moral universals is going to come from looking at what kinds of ideas are already implicit in someone's practice and would be foreclosed by some action, and what kinds of contradictions might be implied between belief and action. And that's where I think we would most fruitfully go to look for moral universals, at internal contradictions and the kinds of limits created by them, and the kinds of actions and beliefs that are framework conditions for a whole plane of experience, and the requirements that are placed on action by those. That's the way that I would look at it, and it's a rather philosophical answer, but it's one which permits all of the kind of multiplicity and diversity that's inherent in the polytheistic worldview as
well. Related to the idea of ethics, morals, etc., is the idea of truth and reality. And I often talk about this when I interview artists of some sort, because a lot of times artists will try to say that art is truth, and I object to that strongly. I say there's a fundamental difference between reality and truth, in that it's reality that, for example, I, Dan, am interviewing Galina and Edward at this moment in time that we are recording. It wasn't true 2 hours ago. It won't be true 2 hours from now. But the statement that Dan is interviewing Galina and Edward about polytheism is true. But that's a comment upon reality. So truth is always something different than reality. Reality is the bedrock, and truth is a comment on it. We can make statements that are either true or false at a given moment. And I don't think a lot of people get that. And I think you see this a lot of times when people talk about my truth about this, whether it's my truth about the version of the Holocaust, for example, or my personal truth about alien abductions, or people who believe that they may have been sexually assaulted and DNA evidence comes back differently, things of that nature. Do you, in either of your views of the cosmos, and polytheistically speaking, do you recognize the difference between personal truths and bedrock fundamental reality that, for example, I would assume that the gods occupy, something deeper than what we have? Either one, Galina or Edward.
I think that there are different levels of truth appropriate to different planes of being. And so, of course, there's a difference between the contingent truth of what some person is doing at some place at some time, as opposed to the kinds of truths that, for instance, like truths of logic or mathematics, couldn't be different without completely resetting the meanings of the terms involved. And then there are also truths that it's simply senseless or poorly posed to question. And I would say that this latter category particularly applies to the gods. I would say that, for instance, to ask whether such and such God exists is actually a senseless question. And this is what Platonists mean when they refer to the gods being beyond being. I would gloss that as meaning that it essentially doesn't make sense to ask whether a certain God is or is not. And so there are different levels of truth and different conceptions of truth appropriate to those different planes of being or levels of experience, if you will.
How about you, Galina?
I would concur with that. I've been sitting here thinking about parsing the difference between truth and reality, and I very much like the way that Edward phrased it.
Okay. Well, let me ask a final question, and then in the final segment, I'll give you both a chance to wrap up any viewpoints. And earlier, Galena had mentioned the sort of silliness that she thought the idea of perfection or perfection in a single or multiple gods would be. So, assuming then that gods are imperfect, maybe not as imperfect as mortal beings such as ourselves, uh, do they have a purpose to improve themselves the way we might as well? And if so, or if not, for example, then is there any inherent meaning in the gods that they don't have any purpose themselves? Galena, let me start with you since you brought up
Okay,
perfection.
yeah. Okay. The reason that I dislike the term perfection when applied to the gods is that there is something static about perfection. And our gods are not static, unchanging beings. They are eternal, they are essential, they are good, but they are not static. There is something that is brittle in perfection. And that is why I object to it being applied to our gods. It's also a quality of, it's a value judgment coming from, again, it's us putting value judgment on the gods. And that's a line that I will not cross. That's a line that I don't think that we as human beings are capable of crossing effectively and reverentially. To say that the gods do not have relevance because they are engaging or not engaging in some cycle of perfection is, I think, missing the point of the gods themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It leaves me at a loss because it shows such a chasm in our respective understanding of the way the world works.
Well, since you brought up the idea of stasis, though, if we're not talking about perfection or some qualitative thing, in what way do the gods wax and wane in some way that they're not static? How do they change?
I don't know.
Well, because they're engaged with us.
Yeah.
They're engaged with a cosmos which is constantly changing.
Uh-huh.
And so, to that extent, through their engagement with the cosmos, yes, they're in that respect changing. But it's their engagement with a changing object which is changing. The gods certainly aren't static. They're alive. They're living beings. That's essential to their nature.
Closed off from that which they have created. They're not isolated beings. They're not isolated in perfection, in stasis.
No.
That's the point that I really want to emphasize. They are constantly engaging with us.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give Galena and Edward some final thoughts on the matter, and we'll do that in a moment. I have been speaking with Galena Kraskova and Edward Butler about the ideas, history, and concepts related to polytheistic beliefs. In the break, while we were just waiting, I was asking Galena if she could, in her summary, give a little bit of an idea of, she's mentioned that she's part of clergy. Talk about what that office is. Can you marry people? What are the duties that you do? And then wrap up your final thoughts, Galena.
Sure. I was very struck in our previous conversation where Edward had drawn the distinction that he's a philosopher and I'm clergy. And I hadn't thought about it up until this point, but it very much does impact in some fairly nuanced ways the way that we approach these topics. I've been ordained numerous times, both within my religion and through an interfaith seminary. I suppose I could marry if I wanted to. I tend to prefer not to do weddings. My job as a priest, there are different types of priests. I provide spiritual counseling, and I lead ritual services and tend upwards of 30 shrines. I prefer not to do weddings. It's not my favorite thing in the world. I prefer to specialize more in spiritual direction and in ritual work.
You said virtual services. Does that mean that you have like you have like a group online that you have people?
I'm sorry. I think I probably didn't enunciate clearly enough. Religious services.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, while I can work with people for spiritual direction who via Skype or the internet, my working group is in person.
Well, let me just ask then finally your personal opinion of the future of polytheism. Do you think that it will always be? Do you think that there will be a greater acceptance of it, or do you think what are your thoughts of going forward?
Well, I think that even though we are in the process of restoration now, we are picking up threads that were destroyed when monotheism, specifically Christianity, gained dominance. And we've lost a lot. I think it's important for polytheists to remember that our gods and ancestors hold those mysteries, and that that's not ever really been lost. We can get those things back. And I very much hope, the future of polytheism will see more fervent focus on actively restoring our lineages, actively restoring our traditions, and more unification amongst various polytheistic denominations in holding a line against those that would try to destroy them. Because there are a lot of naysayers, and it is kind of an uphill battle. So I'm hoping that polytheism will be more firmly rooted over the next couple of decades, so that we can, well, we won't see it, but so that our children's children may find themselves once more living in a polytheistic dominant world.
Edward, what are your final thoughts in general and also specifically to the future of polytheism in the coming decades or a couple of centuries?
Well, first, it occurs to me that I didn't get a chance earlier to mention my website.
Go ahead.
Henadology.wordpress.com. HENADOLOGY.wordpress.com, which is where I post a lot of my work, articles that I've published, where I'm allowed to where I'm not constrained by publishers' agreements and the like. I try to post as much as I can of my work there, so people can go there and learn a lot more about my work. With respect to the future of polytheism, to me, the future is bright for polytheism because I think the intrinsic intellectual importance of it is something that is irrepressible at this point. And I think that even people who aren't polytheists or aren't going to be polytheists have something to learn from polytheism and from engaging with it, at least intellectually. But I think a big part of the future of polytheism lies in forging alliances between the small and sundered traditions of polytheism in the West that people like Galina and I and others are engaged in reviving, with the living, continuous, large polytheistic traditions of India, of China, of Japan, of indigenous peoples all over the world. Mm-hmm. And what I would most like to see in the future is a greater sense of solidarity and alliance between those living, continuous indigenous traditions and those of us in the West who are reviving traditions that were historically sundered. So that's something that I see as being particularly key in the future, and something that I think has the promise of being really transformative in terms of the kinds of splits that we experience today between the West and the East, between industrialized and indigenous civilizations and so forth, which can be in very fruitful ways problematized by these kinds of alliances.
Yeah, I've interviewed numbers of people. I've done one with a fellow who is a Buddhist, a well-known Buddhist. I've done one with an Episcopal priest who broke with his church, or Episcopal archbishop. I've interviewed Christian fundamentalists. I've interviewed people who were atheists and whatnot. And I think the main thing I find amazing is that you have a right to believe what you want to believe, and you have a right to respect someone else's belief, even if you don't believe in their belief. You don't have a right to believe that, to have to believe their belief. And I think that's one of the things that I've always found the most disturbing, though, is that as long as you respect someone else's right to believe something, even if you think it's silly or destructive or something, as long as they're not acting upon them in ways to harm other people, I don't see really any reason to get all up in arms. But I want to thank both Galina and Edward. I will link to Henodology, Edward's website, and Gangleri's Grove, which is Galina's. And just want to thank you for spending some time to talk to me about polytheism.
Oh, this was awesome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yes.